Hello everyone, and welcome to the second session of the conference. This second session will be devoted to a topic that for some of us might be quite familiar. We will be now moving from the 13th, 15th century to the 16th, 18th century. That means we'll be moving from the Middle Ages to the modern period. Geographically, we will be moving also from the Mediterranean to the Northern Sea and far beyond, to the Atlantic, to the Pacific, and to the Indian Oceans. And we will do so in order to find out the keys that explain how a country with a population of only 2 million, which achieved actual independence in late 16th century, in 1584, from the Habsburg Empire and specifically from the Castilian king Philip II, few decades later, in the 17th century, was able to rule over the oceans of the world. We're talking, of course, about the Dutch Republic, which dominated the global shipping trade during that period. And just as an illustrative example, at that time, of the 20,000 trade ships that existed, 15,000 were Dutch. 70% of world trade was being conducted by the Dutch, and this is a successful story that also brought the creation of the Dutch East India Company in the 1602, with the important innovation that it was based on shares. Also in 1609 of the world's first stock exchange in Amsterdam. This is a legacy, or the actual current legacy, also partially explains why in the present the most important and crowded trade harbor in Europe is that of Rotterdam. This is a story of success that explains how shipbuilding, shipping, and trade can become agents of growth, prosperity, development, and ultimately of power projection. Having said this, the core question of this session will be considering, even though all these elements, whether the Dutch Empire was either maritime or continental. And to discuss about this and to address these very interesting and revealing points about this case, it's a pleasure to count today with us with the presence of Victor Enthoven. He's an historian. He received his PhD from Leiden University in 1996, specialized in history of the overseas expansion, especially in the Atlantic world. In 2004, he co-edited the volume Riches from the Atlantic Commerce, Dutch Transatlantic Trade and Shipping from 1585 to 1870, together with Johannes Posma, and which was published by Brill Editions. In 2010, he co-edited the work The Navigator, the Log of John Anderson from 1640 to 1643, which was also published by Brill. He has contributed to several other volumes, such as the European Friends of the American Revolution, which was published in 2023 by the University of Virginia Press. Dr. Enthoven has been a professor of the Royal Netherlands Naval College and also affiliated with the Free University of Amsterdam, where he was senior researcher from the NOW project, Dutch Atlantic Connections from 1680 to 1800. This project focused on the circulation of goods, people, and ideas in the Dutch Atlantic world. The structure of this session will be the same as the one that we had before. There will be a first presentation of around roughly 40-50 minutes, and then we will move to questions and debate. Thank you very much, and Mr. Enthoven, the floor is yours.
Test. Thank you very much for this introduction and, of course, for the invitation to come to Barcelona. I will start now. You may be wondering this picture. Well, I will start with a kind of anecdote, and maybe it can act as a kind of inspiration for the people of Catalonia. I'm living in Leiden, the oldest university city of the Netherlands. In fact, Stadtholder William of Orange established the university in the name of King Philip II, and you call him Philip of Aragon. And he was overlord of the Low Countries, today's comprising of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And the university was established in January 6th, 1575. And on the act, there was even the royal seal of King Philip. And that's rather surprising, as you will notice. It was an acknowledgement of the courageous resistance of the people of Leiden against the troops of the Duc de Alba, the governor of the Netherlands on behalf of Philip II. Spanish troops laid siege before the city between October the 30th, 1573, till October the 3rd, last Thursday, 1574. The population almost starved. What we see here, this picture, is Burgomaster van der Werf, who offers his body to the starving people of his city. So can they devour his body in order to get some food. Of course, this painting is a 19th century romantic image what actually happened in the city. Since that date, so October the 3rd, 1574, there was the Thanksgiving service in the Pieterskerk. That used to be a Roman Catholic church called St. Peter, but of course it was transformed to a Protestant church and now it's only called Pieterskerk. And that service has been, the Thanksgiving service has taken place since 1574. So if we count how many years, to this year it was the 450th time that the Thanksgiving service was held in the Pieterskerk. And actually, I attended the service last Thursday. Today there are around October 3rd, the liberation of Leiden, many festivities. Traditionally dictates to have a meal of hutspot, and even it's the English translation, hutspot, and it comprises of potato, onions, and root. The Dutch are not very familiar, not very famous because of their fine cuisine. And we eat herring and white bread. And those two have a very different origin. After the Spanish units had left, a young boy crawled out of the starving city and found a cooking pot of this food in a Spanish fortified position. And the fortified position is called Lammerschans. And a most famous road where I live near is even today called Lammerschans Road. Of course, to eat hutspot with onions, potato, and root is an invented tradition stemming from the 19th century. As you can imagine, potatoes were not available in the Low Countries in 1574, so it's an invented tradition. Probably the Spaniards would have eaten, the Spanish troops would have even eaten a kind of hutspot, but comprising of beans, root, and onions, and they would have a kind of chorizo, sausage, to accomplish that dish. Today we have a beef with it, called klapstuk. The herring and white bread were brought by the so-called sea beggars who had liberated the city. Military speaking, this is a rather interesting operation. They used an offensive inundation. As you probably know, the Low Countries with its flat countryside and many rivers, canals and polders, land reclaimed from lakes and sea, to inundate the countryside was a well-used method as a defensive measure against an offensive of the troops of the enemy invading the country. And the last inundation took place in 1940, at the start of the Second World War, to no avail, actually. The German troops, they overran the Dutch troops, and in a few days they had conquered the country. But to use inundation, so to flood the land with water in an offensive manner, is a rather unique operation, military speaking. And what we see here is how the sea beggars coming from the south, in inland boats, the small boats, and they inundated Here, this is a dike, so they cut the dike. In several places, all this countryside was inundated. And they managed to sail to the city of Leiden. So they are coming from the south. As a result of the inundations, or actually, so this is an early 17th century picture. Leiden is on the left. So this is Leiden, and here you see the ships of the small boats. This is an enlargement. Here you see the Spanish position called Lammen. Lammen Schans. A schans is a fortified position. They left the position, and here you see the inundated countryside with the ships, the small ships, small boats of the watergeuzen, the sea beggars. And they even sailed into the city. But you see, the fortified position was already empty, and so that small boy could fetch a pot of hutspot. The motto of the city of Leiden is, and I quote, "Rather to be Turkish than papal." Nowadays, it's maybe not that much, but okay. But to give an inclination of about that struggle, and the key, the symbol of the city is a key, and it represents we never handed over the key of the city to the Spanish troops. That is the symbol of it, and as you can see. The colors are red and white. And especially in the morning of October the 3rd, most people in Leiden, they wear red and white. So we recognize each other. We are members of the same kind of fraternity. And there are around 17,000 people in Leiden who go into the streets clothed like this. So maybe the Catalan people can have some inspiration about to fight, well, and I will stop here. The Dutch Republic, Maritime or Continental? The short answer is both. The archetype of a maritime power is, of course, England, with its wooden wall of the ships of the Royal Navy. The concept of sea power, developed by the American naval officer Alfred Thayer Mahan, published in 1890, or he published in 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660, 1783. And the book was based on the Royal Navy and England during that period and the dominance of the Royal Navy in the 18th century. And for an archipelago, that makes sense, that you have a wooden wall of warships. Well, that's what you think. If you look at Japan, also an archipelago, Japan during the Tokugawa period, and that is between 1603 and 1867, was not a maritime power whatsoever. And I can't pronounce his name correctly, but I will try. Samurai Hayashi Shihiyu, 1738-1793, wrote a book out about the defense of Japan in the 18th century. And for him, the sea is both a protection mode and a means of invasion. His thinking deals how Japan as an archipelago can be defended against aggression from the sea. And in his opinion, Japan had to be defended from the land with fortification and an army, a mobile army, and fortifications alongside the shore. So no navy whatsoever. Although Japan was an archipelago, it had a completely different concept about defending the homeland. The Netherlands, in two aspects, the Netherlands was conquered from the sea. First, physically, and secondly, as an independent republic. Physically, by building dikes as a protection against the sea and the rivers, and reclaiming land from the water, the so-called polders. And polder is a typical Dutch name. The lowlands were liberated from the tyrannical rule of Philip II, King of Spain, and his deputy, Duc d'Alba, from the sea, by the seabaggers. And I call him a tyrant because, as we saw in the previous presentation, the overlord or the crown or the king doesn't have the prerogative to impose taxation. That is to tax the people. That is a matter of the people itself, and not something from the crown or the king. And Duc d'Alba, he introduced a 10% taxation, and it was inspired, I don't think I pronounce it correctly, but from a Spanish or a Castilian taxation called alcabala, something like that, a 10% tax on every transaction. And that was not allowed. There was no law to sustain that. So in that respect, Duc d'Alba acted like a tyrant. And let's say in Roman law, it was allowed to raise against a tyrant. And actually the same happened 2 centuries later in North America. The North Americans raised against the King of England because of the illegal taxation of the North Americans. And they said, no taxation without representation. With a large merchant marine, fishing fleet and vast overseas empire, the Dutch Republic was definitely economic and maritime nation. I wouldn't explain what a kind of maritime commercial power the Dutch were in the 17th century. Their fleet, or let's see, the commercial fleet comprised of 3,500 ships. So it was not that big, but it was still the largest commercial fleet of Western Europe. And you could say, on sea, at sea, they were an economic powerhouse. Here, during my presentation, I will look at 3 different topics. Institutional, how was the Navy organized? Culturally, and military strategically. Those are the 3 topics I will deal with. Institutionally. In 1572, the so-called Geuzen, derived from the French word le gueux, beggars, poor people, liberated the small port of Den Briel, April the 1st, 1772. And we have a saying in Dutch, I can't translate it in English, it says, Alpha lost his, Alpha verloor zijn bril, Alpha lost his spectacles, because Briel, the city of Briel, it's almost the same word as spectacles in Dutch. So he lost his spectacles on April the 1st, and that's not a joke. The next years, the War of Independence concentrated in the Scheldt estuary in Zeeland and the Zuiderzee near Amsterdam. Zeeland is in the southwest, comprising of several islands. Here we have Amsterdam, and this is the Zuiderzee. So the War of Independence concentrated on those waters. In 1579, the Union of Utrecht was signed, a defense treaty between 8 provinces in the northern part of the Low Countries. And it comprises of the provinces of Gelderland, this is over here, Overijssel, Drenthe, very poor, Groningen, Friesland, Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht. And the other parts, they were later conquered from the Habsburgs. And they were kind of, you could say, colonies, because they were not represented in the national governing body in The Hague. Sovereignty was held by the states, or the État, meaning the highest governing body of the province. So, what was so a completely new institutional entity was created in Northwest Europe, a republic of citizens and not subjects. Of course, we had already the Eidgenossenschaft in Switzerland, what was also a republic, but of course Switzerland is not on the sea, so in that respect Switzerland is very different from the Dutch Republic. To be not a subject means you are allowed and you have the freedom to mind your own business. There is no higher power in place. In other words, they, or at least the elite, couldn't mind their own business. The fleet was no longer an instrument of dynastical interest, but rather to protect the interest of the elite of predominantly merchants. So the fleet was used to protect commercial interests and not any dynastical interest. Warships were first and foremost to wage economic warfare, including blockades, convoy duties, and guerre de course, or privateering against enemy merchant ships. By the 1590s, 5 so-called admiralties were established in 3 maritime provinces. In Zeeland, you had an admiralty. In Holland, you had 3 admiralties. And in Friesland, you had the 5th, but that was also the smallest one. And an admiralty is an organization responsible in building and fitting out the warships. And Zeeland, Holland, and Friesland, they are the 3 maritime provinces. The other provinces are so-called land provinces. The main task of the admiralties were to build and equip the men of war and to formulate a maritime strategy. At least twice a year, in spring and in the fall, the governors of the 5 admiralties would meet in The Hague to discuss all matters relating to the war at sea. In total, there were 45 admiralties, of 45 governors, dispersed over the 5 admiralties. And I have to explain something about the funding of the warships. It was dual. About, let's say, 30% was funded by a taxation of trade and shipping. And those funds were mostly used for convoy duties. After 1600, the rest of the money came from all 8 provinces. They subsidized the rest of the war fleet. And that money was especially used to have a blockade of the Habsburgs, Netherlands, so Flanders, that was still Habsburg, and they also used later on the battle fleet. So the whole country was part of financing the fleet, not only the 3 maritime provinces, but all 8 provinces. As a consequence, that the 5 admiralties comprised of 55 governors coming from all 7, in this case not 8, because Drenthe was too poor to contribute financially to the war fleet. So the small country of Drenthe was not represented in the admiralties, but the rest of, so all 7 provinces were represented in the 5 admiralties. Well, you can imagine that most of the governors came from Holland. Do you see the, oh, okay, came from Holland, because 3 of the 5 admiralties were located in Holland. In Zealand, there were also from different islands representatives, and the same was true for Friesland. But if you look that, for instance, Groningen, there are 2 representatives of Groningen allocated in one of the admiralties. Gelderland had 4 representatives, Utrecht 5, Overijssel 4, and Groningen had 3. So 70% of the governors came from the maritime provinces, and 30% came from the land provinces. So if you look institutionally, the Navy, or the warships, or the admiralties, were a true national institution. It was not something only from the coastal regions, but it was truly national. And this also shows how very elaborate the institutions of the Dutch Republic were. Because first of all, you had 8 sovereign provinces, and they worked together mainly in defending the country. So in that respect, you can compare to NATO. And as a consequence, that means that eventually every separate province would accept the proposal. And that in general, they accepted the proposal, for instance, on the budget, or on how to use the army, or how to use the fleet. But, so in that respect, so in The Hague, you had a proposal, and then the representatives, the 8 representatives, had to go back to the provincial capital to discuss it with the states, with the État, and then had to come back to The Hague to say, okay, we are okay, we will follow this initiative. And although Drenthe had a representation in the States General, the national executive body, they didn't have a vote. So they only had a representation but no vote. In that respect, it was a very, you could say, inefficient system, but still during the 17th century, they were able to get one of the most powerful fleets of Europe at sea. And the point I want to make, if you look institutionally and financially, the fleet was a completely national entity. If we compare that with England, I'm not a specialist on the Royal Navy or the institution of England, but I would imagine if you look at the organization of the fleet and if you look at how the Royal Navy was funded, I would imagine it was the coastal areas with the ports that financed the Royal Navy predominantly, and that the organization of the Admiralty was in London. So it was a very centralized organization. And if you would go to, let's say, for instance, Yorkshire, and you would ask a farmer, what do you know about the Royal Navy? I don't think that he has a picture about what the Royal Navy will mean. While someone from, let's say, Arnhem, that is here, so Farland inland, he paid part of the fleet. And his city was represented in several of the admiralties. So even Farland inwards, there was a notion and a commitment with the fleet. So, and in that respect, you could say that institutionally, the fleet was a national institution. And in that respect, you can say institutionally, the Dutch Republic was maritime, was a maritime nation. Let's talk about culture. What I told you, the Dutch Republic emerged from the sea, literally. During the first decades, the struggle was concentrated on the Scheldt River in Zeeland, in the southwest, and the littoral waters of Flanders with a blockading fleet. The sovereign and independent state of Zeeland ordered between 1593 and 1604 6 large tapestries depicting the naval war of independence on the Scheldt River during the 1570s. And this is today in the museum, and you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so 5 of the 6 tapestries. And this is a detail of the siege of the city of Veere in 1572, May 16th till May 18th. But so 20 years after the battles in the waters of Zeeland, the states of Zeeland ordered the manufacturing of the 6 large tapestries, depicting the importance about that part of the War of Independence. What developed over the next couple of decades was a naval hero cult. What you see is the epitaph of Jacob van Heemskerk. And he's famous for several different things. First of all, during the 1590s, he tried to find a sea route to Asia via a northern route. Well, at that point of time, that was very difficult because there was a small ice age going on, meaning that in the wintertime, the northern route was closed. Today it's different. It's still possible to sail north of Russia from east to west and from west to east during wintertime. But around 1600, that was not impossible. So they got stuck in the ice, and they went to Nova Zembla, a small island north of Russia. I think it's called nowadays Novaya Zemlya. And during the winter of 1596-97, they spent the whole winter on that island. What they did, they took the timber from the ship and they built a cabin. And they had, of course, shotguns or guns, and they shot polar bears and not wolves, but foxes, Arctic foxes, and that's how they survived the winter, because they were not equipped, and it must have been terrible, but all members survived the winter. There were no casualties. In spring, when the ice receded, they took the timbers from the cabin and they built a boat. And then they sailed to Norway. And during that last leg of the journey, 1 or 2 members of the crew, they perished, but that was in the spring. Jacob van Heemskerk, he survived. And later he became admiral of the fleet. And he participated in the Battle of Gibraltar, 1607, April the 25th of April, a Dutch fleet, and I will come to that later, they encountered a Spanish fleet or a Castilian fleet near Gibraltar, and well, if the Dutch fight an enemy at sea, in the end they will win. So that happened at least in the 17th century. Not in the 20th century, but in the 17th century. Jacob van Heemskerk fell during the Battle of Gibraltar, 1607. And he was the first naval hero. And to become a naval hero, the definition is you have to be a naval officer and you have to die at sea. So not in your bed at home, then you're no hero, because naval officers fade away like generals, but if you perish at sea, then you can become a naval hero. And Jacob van Heemskerk in 1607 was the first naval officer to have a state funeral. And later on, this epitaph was placed for him, I think in the new church in Amsterdam, but I'm not I don't know exactly where it is. But that was 1607, the first state funeral for a naval hero. In 1657, Mr. Thesis published a booklet, and I have the translation below, Naval History or Lucid Description of the Most Famous Battles that Took Place at Sea from the earliest time until the Peace of Spain. Peace of Spain is 1648, the Westphalia Peace, the Dutch and the Belgian Confederates, who were for the most part, of course, victorious. And that gives a list of all ready, let's say, not only the most important naval battles, but also the naval officers and the naval heroes, those officers who didn't survive the battle. Which means that at the middle of the 17th century, there was already an extensive naval hero cult developed in the Dutch Republic. And at the end of the 17th century, a pantheon of some 40 naval heroes exists in the Dutch Republic. Okay. If you look at England, how many naval heroes do we know from England? Okay, 1.5. Drake, maybe. Okay, where is his grave? Where is Drake, Francis Drake, buried? Nobody knows. Okay, everybody knows, of course, Trafalgar Square and the statue of Horatio Nelson. So, although England, the archipelago England, with the wooden wall of the Royal Navy, they have only 1.5 naval heroes. This is a drawing of Piet Hein. He died 1629, but a year before that he became rather famous because he conquered the Spanish fleet at Matanzas near Cuba. And then he became, in 1629, he became admiral, and then he perished at sea. And this is a drawing. Okay, I can show you 50 different paintings of Dutch naval heroes. So I will make a small selection. This is Jan van Galen, an official engraving. He perished in 1653 during the First Anglo-Dutch War. And this is at the end of, this is in 1704, William Bastiaan Schepers, and he died during, I think, the war of the Spanish succession. The Spanish succession, 1604. But what I said, I can show you dozens more of formal paintings of naval heroes. As a part of the cult, there are many biographies, of course. And this is, well, this is not actually a naval officer. This is a captain from the Dutch East India Company. He became very famous. And as a young boy, I was 7, I read his adventures in the Dutch East Indies. William Eybrandszoon Bontekoe. His name means collared cow. Bontekoe, a koe is a cow, and bont means collared, so his family name means collared cow. This is, of course, our greatest hero of all time, and he even was elected as the most important Dutchman of all time, Michiel Adriaanszoon de Ruyter. And this is an engraving from his biography. I think 20 years after his demise, an official biography was published about Michiel Adriaanszoon de Ruyter. But there are many more biographies, pamphlets about our naval heroes. But we are going on. There are, for those 40 naval heroes, there are mausoleums built. And this is the mausoleum of Michiel de Ruyter in the new church of Amsterdam. And this is a mausoleum in Middelburg, in the province of Zeeland, from the Evertsen brothers, Johan and Cornelis Evertsen. And again, this is again a small selection of the dozens of mausoleums in, or I have a small list over here. The sculptor Rombout Verhulst, he specialized in carving those statues surrounding the mausoleum itself. And to name but a few of those mausoleums, Jan van Galen, Amsterdam, 1656. Maarten Tromp in the city of Delft, 1658. Kortenaar in Rotterdam, 1665. Van Wassenaar Opdam, The Hague, 1667, Isaac Sweers, Amsterdam, 1675, Van Gent, Utrecht, 1676, and Michiel de Ruiter, Amsterdam, 1681. So those mausoleums of naval heroes, they are not concentrated in one city, not in Amsterdam alone, but in Delft, Utrecht, Rotterdam, Middelburg. So, and in that respect, it was also a more or less national cult. Not only for, if we look at, no, I will come to that later. And then, as part of the maritime culture, marine paintings. The Dutch Republic was the European market for seascapes and maritime paintings during the 17th century. There were many dozens of specialized marine painters. And what we see here, this is a picture painted in 1621, depicting the Battle of Gibraltar of 1607. And that took place April 25th, 1607. And what we see here is the exploding Spanish admiral ship which left a Dutch warship. And you can imagine that most paintings about sea battles are painted years later. In this case, it was 15 years later painted. But I can show you 250 different paintings about sea battles during the 17th century. But marine paintings are not always about sea battles. What we see here is the loading of timber in a Norwegian fjord. Dutch ships, you can see it because of the flags, anchoring in a sort of kind of romanticized Norwegian fjord, but it's depicting a day, a daily occupation of loading timber in a small hole in the hull. So marine paintings is not always about spectacle or shipwreck or sea battles, but also the day-to-day business of dealing in this case, in timber. What we see here is the battle at Dunes, and Dunes is in the south of England, 1639, by William van der Velde the Elder, that's the father. A Spanish armada was sailing from Cadiz to Flanders to supply the army of Flanders, the Habsburgs army of Flanders. And they were stopped in the English Channel, and they anchored at Downs, as it nowadays is called. And after a few months, Maarten Tromp attacked the anchored Spanish fleet over there. Most soldiers eventually ended up safely in Flanders. And what we see here is that some of the Spanish ships were captured. For instance, the Santa Teresa. I think that's the ship of the admiral. And I'm very fond of this kind of griseus, black and white paintings. It's done by a pen. And they're very detailed. So if you are, and they are, let's say, to have another example, this is the battle at Ter Heide, 1653, the first Anglo-Dutch war. And this is the sea battle between Maarten Tromp versus George Monk. and it was a complete disaster for the Dutch. The Royal Navy did have already a purposely built battle fleet of ships, battleships. And battleships are the most heavily armed ships at that moment. That's, you could say, the definition of a battleship. And it was comprised, its purpose was to have a battle with another warship. So the more armament, the better. The Dutch, on the other hand, were only interested in protecting economic interest, mainly convoying merchantmen and fishing vessels. And if you, for warships to wage an economic war or to be used in an economic war, heavy armament is not essential. Some armament is useful, but they were not the most heavily armed ships. And during the first year of the First Anglo-Dutch War, what happened was a Dutch fleet mainly comprised of converted merchantmen had to fight against purposely built battleships. Well, figure it out. The outcome is obvious. It was a complete disaster for the Dutch. William van der Velde the Elder, he participated at the battle at Ter Heide. And he sailed in a very small vessel over here. And here you can see him. This is his drawing board, making sketches of the battle. So he eyewitnessed the battle. Of course, this is not one moment during the battle. This comprises of many different scenes during the day or the days. But in a sense, it's actual. And he made, in real time, sketches what happened. And if you look at the detail of those black and white paintings, you can imagine they are, for an historian, a useful source in what is happening during a sea battle or life at sea, or what is the rigging, or what is the armament, or what are the sailors doing at that particular time during a battle. In 1672, at the beginning of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, father and son, so William van der Velde the Elder and his son William van der Velde the Younger, moved to London, 1672, to work in the service of King Charles II. As you maybe know or not know, in 1672, the Third Anglo-Dutch War broke out. Dus at that time, father and son were already in London working for the enemy, or at least from a Dutch point of view. And from that time on, the most English marine paintings depicting naval battles are of Dutch origin, because especially the son, William van der Velde the Younger, depicted many English warships and many English battles since 1672. This is, for instance, the Battle of Kijkduin, August 1673, painted by William van der Velde the Younger. And it depicts the English side of the battle. And what we see is the fight between arch enemies Cornelis Tromp. Cornelis Tromp was the son of Maarten Tromp, fighting Edward Spragg. And Spragg died during the battle. But who has ever heard of Spragg? And where is Spragg buried? Nobody knows. He does have a grave in Westminster Abbey, but it's very small. It's not a mausoleum like our heroes. So this is to give you some examples of an idea about what maritime culture means in 17th century the Netherlands. The last part of my presentation was the Dutch Republic continental or maritime. For a continental nation, its existence was threatened by its neighboring countries. The threat came from the land side. That's the definition of a continental power. As a consequence, its maritime strategy is always subordinate to the land war. In other words, the army is primus, the fleet is secundus. To illustrate, as an example, I always use the imperial Germany at the beginning of the 20th century and during the First World War. The German Imperial Navy had heavily invested in its Hoogzeevlotte, its high seas fleet, of battleships and battle cruisers. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz was the architect of the fleet, and he envisioned a force powerful enough to challenge the Royal Navy. However, the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet was much stronger than the German Hoogzeevlotte. During World War I, by conducting some daring sorties in the North Sea, the Germans tried to lure out an isolated portion of the Grand Fleet. These operations culminated in the Battle of Jutland in May-June 1916, where the Hoogzeevlotte confronted the whole of the Grand Fleet. The battle was inconclusive, but the German battleships never sailed again. And although as a fleet in being, the Hoogzeevlotte posed still a threat, in practice the Royal Navy dominated the North Sea and the Atlantic from that moment. As a consequence, the Germans reinstated the unrestricted submarine warfare, a typical continental strategy of more accurate a non-navalism deployment of resources, in this case by targeting merchant ships supplying Great Britain. Economic warfare does not fit in the concept of sea power or navalism, in which it can influence, compel, or deny other countries' actors the sea. I am not a specialist in the concept of sea power. I have heard it involves the most powerful ships engaging with each other in large sea battles. Sometimes deciding a war, an idea most popular among naval officers because it includes large and powerful ships. And naval officers are men, and men like to have big things, in this case ships. As a scholar, I'm much more interested in the concept of economic warfare, including convoying merchant ships, blockading, and especially guerre de course or privateering, involving less powerful ships and sometimes involving private military firms, even in the 17th century. So, was the Dutch Republic a maritime power? To cite Andrew Lambert, who is unfortunately not present today, I would love to have a discussion with him. And he says about the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, the Republic only operated as a sea power for 20 years. And the identity was never taken to heart by the nation at large. So the Dutch was, on the one hand, a maritime nation with a maritime culture and a maritime identity, primarily economically dominated by trade and shipping, but still the identity of a maritime power was never taken to heart by the nation at large. And even this is for me much too optimistic. Military strategically, the Dutch Republic was a continental power, albeit with important maritime interest and perhaps even a maritime identity, but she was not a maritime power like England. In the case of a maritime power, the military strategic focus is mainly on the neighbors, with the greatest threat coming not from the sea, but from the land. For the Republic, that threat came from the south, first from the southern region, the Habsburgs, and later from France, and from the east, from the German princely states. The perfidious Albion, to cite Napoleon, which he means, of course, England, never seriously endangers the survival or the existence of the Dutch Republic. If we look at defense expenditures in 1640, the Dutch were still fighting the Habsburgs' Spanish Empire. You see that the expenditures on the war fleet was only 26%. The rest of the money was going to the army and fortifications. And actually, during the middle of the century, during the three Anglo-Dutch wars, the figures are more or less the same. Even during the three naval wars against England, expenditure for the army was higher than for the fleet. This is in contrast to England, with its wooden wall of warships. The Royal Navy formed England's most important defense line, and the War Fleet therefore had more resources at its disposal than a relatively small army. Conclusion. I'm almost there. Economically, definitely a maritime power. Fisheries, merchant fleet, overseas empire. Institutional, a maritime power, because the war fleet was a national institution, and all provinces were involved in the war fleet, even the land provinces. Culturally, a maritime power. A deep-rooted maritime identity. Cultural, the sea was everywhere. In the Zaan region, and the Zaan region is just located north of Amsterdam, the economy was dominated by whaling. And to have two very silly examples about maritime culture, but in everyday's house, not in large buildings, but normal people, a fan depicting a whaler. And this is a mobile from, let's say, around 1750, probably hanging in a children's room. And even, let's say, normal people, they had a maritime identity in the 17th and the 18th century. So definitely, culturally, a maritime nation. Military, strategically, not so much, in my opinion. There was too much threat from the continent to call the Dutch Republic a maritime power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Enthoven. It was a very insightful and interesting presentation, and now we will rapidly moving to questions and answers. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about something that you didn't touch in your very interesting lecture, and I would like to know if you have anything to say about the interplay between the maritime power and the investment in maritime versus land power and the political situation in the Dutch Republic, and especially the conflict between the Republican factions and the Orangist monarchist factions. Because if I'm not wrong, maritime strategies tended to go with the Republicans and the other, and I don't know exactly what's the reason why, or if you have anything to say about it. I don't know if the question was, about, the relationship between the debate between investing in the army and investing in a maritime power, and the conflicts between Republicans and Orangists within the Dutch Republic. I would like to know what you have to say about it.
I understand that. Do you want a short answer or a long answer?
Not more than 5 minutes.
Not more than 5. So that must be
like
the short answer. The Orange family, it's very different from what you think it is. They were, as stadtholder, they held the highest office. So they were a kind of civil servant. So they had to be elected by the provinces. Because what I told you, sovereignty was held by the provinces. The highest state power was not a king, but the people from a province. And in that respect, the stadtholder was the commander-in-chief. And in that role, he played a rather important role as commander-in-chief of the army. If we look at the merchants in the city, who actually owned the money, and they paid for the fleet and they paid for the army actually, their interest was maritime overseas trade. So there was always tension between those two factions. And there were two periods in the Dutch Republic, between 1650 and 1672, and between the death of William III, 1604, I think he passed away, till 1742, there were two periods without a stadtholder. So without a commander-in-chief, and then let's say the elite of the cities, they had say, a saying in what would happen. So, and it depends on the period, but you can say, generally speaking, the Orange family is pro-army, and the cities are pro-fleet to protect the commercial interests. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the very interesting insight on the lowlands preferences. You mentioned that the major part of the expenditure is on the army. My question is, if you look at modern Netherlands, it's an inroad for trade into the continent. Is that the case then? Is it just a sort of barrier to incursions from continental powers, but no trade, and so trade is always naval or, well, maritime? Or is there trade between Antwerp, Rotterdam, and the interior of the continent? And the other question is about the Orange. Remember that they did have absolute monarchy power in Britain. William of Orange became the king, an absolute king of England. So,
okay. Your first question, it's, let's say, the role of predominantly Rotterdam as the most important port in Western Europe. The hinterland is Germany. So I don't have the figures, but I would say, but 75%, 3/4 of all imports are shipped to Germany, mostly via the Rhine River. No, yeah. But, well, of course, Germany, if you look at the Netherlands, I don't think I can give you a very good example. But, okay, there you have the Dutch Republic. How big do you think is Germany at that time? or the Habsburg countries. Yes. And for instance, in the 17th and 18th century, we had, let's say, the Dutch Republic comprised of less than 2 million people. 100,000 migrant workers arrived annually in the Dutch Republic from Germany. And most of them left in the fall. Some stayed and then ended up in ports. And if you look at, for instance, the crews of ships, especially the ships of the Dutch East India Company, about 30% were Germans. As a trading nation, you need to have open borders. And in that respect, the Netherlands have a very long tradition of an influx of people, predominantly from Germany, but also from Scandinavia. Yeah. And even during the Anglo-Dutch War, I think 7% of the crew on the Dutch warships were English. And the second question about William III. Well, of course, we have to start in 1688. And maybe I'm a bit biased, but the Dutch conquered England. Okay, make that fair. They had an expeditionary force, they landed in Torbay, and they finished off the English king. And Scotland. And of course, you have the next year, in 1689, you had the battle at the Boyne. That was a divisive battle. And as you maybe know, that even today in Northern Ireland, the Orange Marches commemorate the battle. Okay. And they were orange. Well, a king is never absolute, because he does his power derives, of course, from God. There is a divine thing, and that's going to the king. And the king has a lot of power. He can choose, for instance, religion. In Germany, the prince he could choose, well, we remain Roman Catholic, or we becoming Protestants. So that's a royal prerogative. What not is a royal prerogative is taxation. Never. Because, let's say, the royal power is rooted in the Middle Ages, and in the Middle Ages there was no money, and you had a feudal system based on owning the land. So if you look at the royal powers, taxation was never part of it. But because of the introduction of gunpowder, and as a consequence, standing armies and navies, which are, as you explained, are very, very, very expensive, money was essential. And the sinews of war are money, money, money. But royal power was not able to get hold of money, and had always to act via an état or states, or in the case of England, parliament. And if you look at especially the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the king who ran out of money laid up the fleet at the Medway. That's a river near the Thames River. Then Michiel de Ruyter showed up, and he destroyed, I think, 25 English ships, because Charles had run out of money, and Parliament was not willing to give him a next batch of money. So money is always the constraint of royal power. If you look at France at the end of the 18th century, they run out of money. Dus I'm always following the money. If you look, I'm looking at history and especially at the fleet and the navy. I always ask the question: where's the money coming from? And when the money is run out, it's the end of the conflict.
Hello? Okay. Yes. So my question was precisely... No va? ¿Cómo así, eh? No sé. Okay. Start again. So my question was precisely coming from the point of view of money. Since you mentioned it before, I thought we might talk a bit more about that. Arguably, the success of the Dutch Republic is because they created a safe space for traders to trade. And therefore, they could get more tax revenue, and they could get more credit. That was the same formula as in Venice, a few the previous centuries, and arguably, the British actually won that contest the moment that they provided another safe space for traders, and therefore London became the financial center of Europe. And I was thinking that you might want to comment on that.
Well, first of all, for merchantmen, I think very important is protection of property. So if at the moment there are institutions to protect property, in this case goods, that's a very important aspect to trade. And what happened in the Netherlands, several different institutions developed. First of all, as you mentioned, the Dutch East India Company was financed by stocks. So it was a stock company. And as a result, the beurs developed. And the beurs is the marketplace for financial products. As a consequence of that, insurance developed. And the city of Amsterdam, they established an insurance court. And if you look at the trade at sea, there are two different aspects. One is, and insurance means it's to hand over the risk of the voyage to a third party, and in return you have to pay some money. That's how insurance, and you need a lot of underwriters to spread the risks, like today Lloyd's of London still operates. But as a consequence of that, there was always issues about responsibility. And that means that the Amsterdam court dealt with two different issues. One issue is when the complete ship was lost. Now, this in the most cases quite simple. Then the insurers and the underwriters had to pay till the last cuffling. That's the saying. The other part is about a partial damage for the ship and the cargo. For instance, during a storm, some of the cargo get wet and was not good anymore. There was damage on the cargo, or you had to get rid of the mast to save the ship. Who is responsible then? And the Amsterdam court, they ruled that the merchant involved in ship and/or cargo, they had to pay for that, and the court established the ruling who will pay what. So that's outside the actual insurance. And for merchants trading overseas, that's very useful to have an institution like that. And thirdly, a third Amsterdam institution was the Wisselbank, the banking house of the city, to make a difference between bad money, bad coins, and good coins. They act like a clearinghouse. You can get credit from it. And those institutions were very important for the development of the Dutch Republic during the 17th century. What happened during the 18th century is different. What actually happened after the demise, or actually all during the reign of William III, is that peace returned to England. During the 17th century and also most part of the 16th century, you could say that England was in a constant state of war with itself, in one way or another. And then, during William III, eventually peace came to England, and then they had their act together. And of course, England, especially the United Kingdom, so after the union with Scotland, is much bigger than the Netherlands. The population was maybe 3 times as big as the Netherlands. So in that and especially Parliament could generate much more money than the Dutch Republic. So for me, it's very obvious why the Dutch became a second and even a third-rate country during the 18th century, because of the money.
Please, Mr. Huxley, go ahead with your question.
Victor, understandably, in your presentation, you talked a lot about the relationship with England and the Anglo-Dutch wars, and the raid on the Medway in 1667 is very well remembered as a defeat, as a significant defeat for the Royal Navy. But 350 years later, I don't think there's a partnership amongst European countries in the naval sphere which is closer than that between the Netherlands and the UK. I think they're strongly trusted partners, and for example, the British Royal Marines and the Dutch Royal Marines operate as I understand it, as a force which in war would be totally integrated, and in peacetime exercise very closely. So my question is, what are the contemporary repercussions of the Dutch maritime role of 350 years ago? What are the implications now for the Netherlands' maritime role as a maritime state, in naval terms, in terms of maritime trade, in terms of the template provided by the Port of Rotterdam for maritime infrastructure elsewhere in the world? Because I think it seems to me quite significant.
No.
No?
No, the Netherlands and England are very different. We have a very different culture. On the other hand, culture, there is a kind of closeness. I will elaborate on that first, and then I will give an answer to your question. If you look at the English language, if the use of the words Dutch, it always means something negative. A Dutch crossing, Dutch courage, a Dutch treat. So in the English language, okay. On the other hand, as a country, we are very small if you compare to the UK. But we do both have a kind of Protestant tradition, and of course the Oranges and the Stuarts are very close. And there is a kind of, I wouldn't say understanding, but something like that, meaning that for the English, the Dutch in the last centuries were no threat. And in that respect, the English had, well, kind of, they liked the Dutch a bit, sort of. For instance, you have, if you look at cricket is a hobby of mine, you have the test countries, and then you have the Dutch. So we are, of the small countries, of the small teams, we are, let's say, and a couple of years ago, we beat the English team at Lord's. And Lord's is the home of cricket. So that was a very funny moment. The difference in tradition is about military culture. If you look at Remembrance Day in November, the 11th of November, every self-respecting Brit will wear a poppy. So from the end of October, so the season is coming. Now, we don't have that tradition. So the military is a significant part of the British culture. Not only in England, but I've noticed it and in Scotland too. We don't have that. The military doesn't play any cultural part in the Netherlands. So in that respect, there's a very big difference, culturally speaking. And we are still kind of merchants. So there is no willingness to pay for the army and the fleet. And this year, because of course, the developments in Ukraine, for many decades, for the first time, the budget for the defense budget has reached the NATO standard of 2%. But that's the first time in 30 or 40 years. Before that, we were always below, and you could say we were. If you look at NATO, we're a kind of free riders, not spending enough money on defense. And although we realize that the economic importance of Schiphol and Rotterdam, politically we are not willing to pay for its protection. So is that a kind of answer to your question?
We have a time for a last question.
Well, I'm not a specialist on the subject, neither the period or the region, but my question is if the decline in the 16th century of the Hanseatic League affect on the rise of this Dutch Republic. This is the...
So can you repeat?
In the 16th century, I remember there's a decline in this commercial Hanseatic League between the north.
Mm-hmm.
And if this affect on the rise of this Dutch Republic in the 16th century, giving them this merchant power and sea power, military power.
What you first see during the 16th century is that, first of all, location. The Low Countries in general are located at a very important hub in Europe, between Eastern, or let's say the Baltic and Southern Europe, including France. And on the upper side of the North Sea, there is England. So for the Dutch, it was very easy to sail to the Baltic and then to sail to the Southern Europe, including Portugal, Spain, and after 1590 also the Mediterranean. So in that respect, location is very important. And what I told you, of what I explained before that because of the influx of merchants from Antwerp, The fall of Antwerp was 1585, and at that moment, Antwerp was the economic capital of northwest of Europe. And because of the influx of the merchants from Antwerp, a lot of commercial know-how came to the Dutch Republic. And if you look at insurance, especially maritime insurance, that was starting in Antwerp during, let's say, the 1550s and the 1560s. And after the Antwerpenaren came to Amsterdam, that was developed into the assurance court. So in that respect, you see a continuation from Antwerp to Amsterdam. And what I explained earlier, that the development of institutions like the insurance court, the Amsterdam Bank, and the beurs, the marketplace, that was a very important, let's say, context to protect all kind of, and to regulate all kind of commercial interest. So in that respect, was around 1600, the Dutch Republic was much more modern, or using modern institutions and modern tools, compared to the German Hanseatic League, which was, if you look at the organization and the institutional context, was much more outdated at that moment.
So connecting with one of the remarks that you made also during the questions and answers, technology matters, innovation matters, technique matters, and also when it comes to institution making and development. That's all for this session. Thank you very much once again, Mr. Enthoven, for very interesting remarks now in this case, and also obviously for the presentation. Thanks you everyone for the questions and for the attendance. Hope you enjoyed this session and this first half of the conference. Thank you very much.